All right, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning still. This is Gavin McGuire, event trader, being joined by Carmine Atteo, this our special situations analyst. Carmine, how are you doing today?
Oh, pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. You have a good weekend?
Oh, yeah. Just met some new neighbors and played a little poker, and that was about it.
Nice, nice, nice. How about any of the news over the weekend? Was there anything that was jumping off the page to you?
Yeah. I watched well, not really jumping off the page, but as you know, it was pretty slow weekend. But I watched the interview with President Trump on Meet the Press. I really wish he would have asked about. I really wish Chuck Todd would have asked about China and some more economic issues, but it was mainly some other topics that more other political topics. So as far nothing really too substantial came out of that, except for the Fed comments, which were, basically was a reiteration of his current views. So
Yeah, nothing too surprising that was catching my attention either. But let's turn and pivot towards those G20 meetings. Obviously, that's going to be the big item of the week, so we can start off there. That's going to go on Friday and Saturday in Japan. Where do we currently stand with what's expected from that G20 meeting?
yeah, so I think there's two main outcomes, and I think the markets are more towards the first outcome, but I'll explain why I personally think that there's a better chance than expected of the second outcome. So let's go through the outcomes first. The first possible outcome, I think, is that they agree to keep the dialogue open, that they have a friendly meeting, and they agree to delay the planned $300 billion tariffs for maybe 3 or 4 months, and then reevaluate. That's certainly possible. And I'm not saying that that's definitely not going to happen. And I wouldn't, criticize anyone that has that point of view. But there's also another possible scenario is that they do agree to keep their dialogue open, which I think they'll definitely do. But the tariffs go into effect early July. Now, Jim Cramer, who's on CNBC, of course, said he thought that they would put a 10% tariff, not 25%. And I think that's definitely possible. I even think it's possible they go even lower than that. I even think it's possible they start off with this at 5 if they do the tariffs. Now again, there's still the market expectation that no tariffs go into effect for the next 3 or 4 months. But I do think it is definitely possible that that's the case. The president has over the weekend sent out another couple of tweets being supportive of tariffs and indicating that there's very low inflation and that the price increases that people have warned about for the first $250 billion of tariffs haven't come to pass. And this is a president that likes to double down when the markets are at all-time highs, and when he feels like he feels like he has he's playing with the house's money, so to speak. And he sees that the GDP has increased over 3% for Q1. Q2 is going to be a little softer, but he also sees the markets at all-time highs. And number three, he also sees that the Fed is going to be a little bit more supportive. So I think those are all reasons that these tariffs could go into effect. Now, as far as marketplace here, if you think that I'm right, and you think that there's a higher chance in the market that is expecting that these tariffs go into effect, volatility is really low here. So once it gets closer to this G20 meeting, there's some puts in the SMH that people could consider buying because semiconductors would get hit disproportionately than any other sector. Also, the retail sector would be disproportionately impacted by $300 billion in new tariffs. The Macy CEO on the recent conference call said that this tranche would impact them far greater than any of the other tranches. So those are some names that to keep on the radar just in case that the things don't go as the market is expecting. Now, just to be clear, I don't expect them to be banging on the table and swearing at each other at this meeting. I do expect there to be cordial tone, but just because there's a cordial tone doesn't mean that they couldn't move forward with the tariffs. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. So again, this is something that the market's going to keep an eye on. The $300 billion tranche includes the following products: dairy, agriculture, tobacco, clothes, footwear, steel, aluminum, children's toys, dog toys, appliances, and diapers. So any sector, mainly again retail. The semiconductors would get hit because of they're more into the other tranches. But again, when there's trade uncertainty, people tend to sell those stocks even though they're not involved with this particular tranche. So those are definitely ones to keep on the radar there.
Okay, and just real quick, chart trader jumping back into his Nasdaq long here. It's getting long a half size at 77.6750, risking 12 points. So, Carmine, just to circle back then, so right now, because I thought that the next step was to go from 10 to 25% on the next tranche, or on the current tranche that they're on.
No, the current tranche is already at 25.
That's already at 25. Okay, so that went into play back there. So this is going to be the new 300 billion that could go into effect as early as July 2nd. That's the earliest date.
Yeah, so that date might vary a little bit because what the rule is that the tariffs can be put on 7 days after the final date of the hearings with all the corporations that are impacted by the tariffs. So there might be some filibustering there by some of these businesses in order to push that date back a little bit. But I would expect early July was when these tariffs could go into effect if they decide to do them. Again, it's perfectly feasible, and I understand the view completely that they decide to delay them. And I'm not saying that's definitely not going to happen, but I do think the chances are higher than people are expecting, higher than people think that these tariffs could go into effect. One of the other reasons, too,
that would be Tuesday, right? July 2nd is Tuesday?
Yeah, July 2nd is Tuesday. And, of course, we have the half day on July 3rd for the 4th of July. Then we have the 4th of July on Thursday, so it might be a little bit after that if they decide to go forward. But one of the key aspects for the trade talks, of course, if we go back to their prior trade talks when everything kind of went off the rails a little bit, the U.S. demanded that the China make changes to intellectual property, forced technology transfer, and put some enforcement actions into the trade agreement. So in case China reneges on their agreement, there'll be something that it can kick in to either punish them or to put, to do something there. Now, China relented on this because it would require changes in Chinese law to make these changes. Now, if we're at the point where China doesn't want to change the laws, and I don't think they're going to, and the U.S. is still demanding these things, I don't see how they're going to get to it. Break that stalemate right now. And so if they don't, I just feel like the president could move forward with these tariffs.
All right. Okay, so obviously that's going to be one of the primary things that we will be following this week. So probably going to be a lot of he said, she said stories leading up to that. So again, I'd be careful getting caught up in any of those headlines. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely a great point there. And like I said, if you're interested in the put trades, I would wait till Thursday or Friday before you put that on, because you're going to have number one, you're going to have time decay, and number two, you're going to be kind of bounced around with all these. Navarro said this or Mnuchin said this, which I wouldn't. Those things are important and to the overall trade deal, but I wouldn't trade off those headlines until we get something definitive from the president, because he's going to be the final decision maker on it.
Okay. Before we get into the G20, there's a potential healthcare executive order that could be signed today. You want to give us a little background on that, Carmine?
Yeah. So if you go back a couple months or so, President Trump signed an executive order to disclose the prices for biotech companies. So this is taking it a little step further, and this is requiring hospitals to disclose prices for services that they render. So let's say you go into the hospital and the doctor says, "Oh, you need to get a CT scan of your brain or your heart or something," and the hospitals would be required to disclose what the price of that procedure is going to be, that they're going to bill the insurance and bill you. So it's a little bit of a negative for hospital stocks, because when patients go into these doctor's offices and they're explaining how much this stuff will cost, the doctor will say, $11,000. Some people might say, I don't really need that, So it might be a slight negative for, some of these hospital stocks.
All right. The other big geopolitical event on Donald Trump's plate would certainly be around Iran. There's a lot of stories out over the weekend about this called strike, or the strike being called off at the last second. But one thing that I think got overshadowed was a cyber attack on Iran that came out Thursday that didn't really get a lot of press because most people were focusing on that bombing being called off. But do you see anything over the weekend in Iran, and where do we stand in terms of the latest round of sanctions and perhaps some feedback that we've gotten from our partners over there?
Yeah, so right now, President Trump held off on the strike against Iran because of the amount of civilian casualties that his advisors told him would happen if he did it. So just to circle back, as far as oil, which is one of the key plays off this, crude oil, according to EIA, Iran holds 10% of the world's crude oil reserves. So definitely it's a positive for crude oil if there's any tension between the two nations. Now, I said earlier when we were talking about this that I didn't think there would be any military action because President Trump is kind of a lot more dovish than some of his advisors, and he kind of overruled some of his more hawkish advisors on that. So, but what they did do is they launched a cyber attack on Iran on Thursday. Now, this could be positive for the cybersecurity stocks such as PanW, FTNT, FireEye, Juniper, etc., because Iran could theoretically respond in kind on that. So I'm not saying what they're going to do. I don't know what they're going to do, obviously, but there's a risk of that, and I think these cybersecurity names could be the beneficiary of that because there'll be more attention toward the sector and possibly more money spent on defenses. So again, it's kind of like a defense. Buying the defense stocks when there's a little bit more military conflict, buying the cybersecurity names when there's more cybersecurity conflict.
Yeah, no, that's a great point there. So these are certainly names we'll be keeping an eye out on. I think cyber would probably be the next one that's going to be reporting. They're usually the first one out as a read-through for the group. So I don't see them expected until early August. So we'll keep an eye out on that action, but that's a very good point to make about them. Moving on to the rest of the week, there's a few things on the docket. One of the more interesting ones is going to be the first Democratic debates, which are going to be broken down into Wednesday and Thursday. Now, a lot of focus, all the press is probably going to be looking at some of the wilder headlines. Certainly everybody knows sensationalism sells papers and gets clicks, so
yeah,
everyone's going to be looking at everybody's going to be looking at the free college, the get $1,000 for whatever, and any other freebies. But most of that's going to require 60 votes in the Senate, and it would be pretty hard-pressed to see the GOP losing that many seats. But what are some of the more interesting topics that could be discussed that, as you say, Carmine, with the right Attorney General put into place, could certainly become primary themes for the market, and thus probably a little bit more realistic to pay attention to than some of the headlines that we're going to be inundated with come Thursday and Friday morning.
Yeah, so I think we have to put the headlines into two baskets. I think you did that very well just then, so I don't really have anything to add to that. But as far as the second basket of headlines would be things that the president can theoretically do without congressional approval. So things that fall into that category are not the Medicare for all or the canceling student debt and things like that. Because again, like you said, that would require 60 votes in the Senate to pass. And right now the odds are that the GOP keeps the Senate based on the betting odds, but it keeps 51 votes. So so as far as those things, I would kind of put those off to the side and not trade based on that, because those things are going to be extremely difficult to get through to Congress. But what things that can get through to Congress, or not, things that can be enacted, are some of the more regulatory issues, and as far and tech regulation more specifically, because let's say, hypothetically speaking, that we have a President Warren and she decides that she wants to break up the technology companies. What she can theoretically do is put a sympathetic attorney general into place that would now that person would have to be confirmed by the Senate. If the Senate's GOP control, that's would be more difficult. But let's say that person gets confirmed by the Senate and then decides to take some antitrust action against the technology companies. That can theoretically be done, and that's a lot different than some of the other policies that require congressional approval. So, but again, like I explained last week when we were talking about this, any decision that the executive branch makes will be challenged by the judicial branch. So any decision, again, we're kind of getting far ahead of ourselves here, but any decision that on tech, breaking up of technology companies will be challenged in the courts, and that'll start the whole process over again, just like the Microsoft situation from the late 90s that lasted 2 or 3 years. So again, it's a longer term.
Decade.
Oh, yeah, longer than that, yeah. So yeah, it's a longer term thing. So again, you're going to hear a lot of headlines that this person wants to do this or this person wants to do that. Just consider number one, the chances of that passing, and more importantly, getting 60% if it requires congressional approval. And number two, if it doesn't, consider the other branch of government that's going to challenge anything that the executive branch does. As everybody's seen over the last 2 or 3 years, there's a lot of challenges in the courts to things that the Trump administration does. It's going to be the exact reverse if there's a Democratic president. So again, there's just keep that in mind. But as far as the stock plays for these technology, I would definitely keep Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. Apple a little less so, but Google, Facebook, and Amazon on the radar, because even though I'm explaining right now that the facts are that these things get challenged in the courts and such, when these headlines initially cross, you do see it in reaction in the share. So keep those stocks on the radar.
Okay. Then on the hearing front, pretty quiet there. We got one in the House on broadband mapping with small carrier perspectives on a path forward. Any notable witnesses there that you happen to see, or have they not announced that yet?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is one of the things I wish they would do earlier, but they haven't. They really don't announce the witnesses until the day of. But I would expect somebody to testify there. So but this is a topic that they're going to testify on. So, and on Wednesday, they're going to have a hearing on the spending process for the budget. Now, this is going to be a little bit more interesting because this is going to be the precursor to the FY20 spending deal that they're going to have to put in place by September 30th to avoid a government shutdown and to avoid a debt ceiling issue. So they're going to have to raise the debt ceiling and get a budget by September 30th. They're kind of linking those two together. So there's going to be a lot of negotiations on this throughout, but that's something to keep an eye on for later in the fall.
Okay, then for the Senate, there's a hearing to examine fixing a broken budget and spending process. Is Mnuchin going to be there? Do you know? Or
no, they haven't announced the witness list on that one yet. But I would expect someone from the administration to attend.
Okay, and then one last thing to throw at you, Carmine. First quick question, did you have any earnings previews that you're doing this week?
I'm doing CAG, just that one, I believe. So.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious because the FedEx with the Huawei deliveries, and any thoughts on that? Do you think that'll be a hot topic during their call?
It could be, yes, absolutely, because what happened with FedEx was that they said they had an operational error that caused a package of Huawei products not to get delivered, and China, for their part, doesn't believe that explanation, and they feel that they could retaliate against FedEx on that. So that's definitely going to be a hot topic for FedEx. This is going to be something that may be brought up at the G20 meeting as well. Another thing that could be brought up, although they said they're not going to, is the situation over in Hong Kong. Now, China asked the United States and all their representatives too not to talk about that, but that's not going to stop us from talking about it. So
sure.
yeah. So, but that's something that could be used. China wants to use North Korea as leverage in the trade talks, and on the Trump administration side, they might want to use that situation over in Hong Kong and try to get some concessions out of China because they see what's going on there. So those are two side issues to keep an eye on.
Okay, great. Well, I think that does it for our discussion here.
Oh, I wanted to. I'm sorry, Gavin.
Sorry.
I wanted to. No, it's okay. I wanted to talk about one more thing that I didn't have on the schedule. There was a Senators Mark Warner and Josh Hawley, which Mark Warner is a Democrat from Virginia and Josh Hawley is a Republican from Missouri. They plan to introduce legislation today to require Facebook, Google, and Amazon and other major platforms to disclose the value of their users' data. Again, this is the bipartisan support from each party makes it a little bit more likely that it's going to pass, but again, it's a long process. And just to kind of throw a stand out there for whenever there's introduced legislation that people tend to trade on, that less than 5% of legislation that gets introduced comes up to a vote. I'm not talking about passing, just comes up to a vote. So that's something to keep in mind whenever there's legislation that's introduced and stocks move one way or another based on that. You have to kind of think about what are the odds of it passing. And again, when there's a Republican and a Democrat both supporting it, one from each side of the aisle, it makes it more likely, but it doesn't mean that it's a certainty. It means that, there's a lot first it has to pass out of committee, then Mitch McConnell has to bring it to a vote, then the Senate has to vote on it, and then the whole process has to start in the House. So, again, it's a longer process on that, but again, I want to put that on people's radar as well.
All right, fantastic. Anything else to add at this point here, Carmine?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Well, as per usual, thanks for coming on and joining us, getting us up to speed on that. Always helpful to know where we stand on things before we get the week started, especially since those headlines continue to play a pretty important role, and will continue to do so over the course of this week. So, Carmine, we will talk to you. Maybe we'll do a follow-up on Thursday or Friday if anything of interest comes on those Democratic debates and we get a little bit more clarity ahead of the G20 meeting.
Yep, that sounds good. Thank you, Gavin.
All right, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks again for joining us, Carmine.
Okay.